Today is Thursday, April the 9th, and many of us know that this day in, quote, Holy Week is referred to as Maundy Thursday. It is the day, the evening, that Jesus had the Last Supper with the disciples. This morning for our devotional thoughts, and I'm sorry, it's about 8 o'clock in the morning. You all may get this later on today, and I still want to thank Jesse and Allison for getting these podcasts out to you all. That we turn to John chapter 13. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The passage goes on to read that after the supper, the devil had put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus, and it describes not only the Last Supper, but also Jesus is washing the disciples' feet. Let me just help you understand something, that on this night, on the Jewish calendar, they would have participated in the Passover meal. And if you go back to Egypt, and maybe many of you were able to watch Saturday night, the Ten Commandments, fantastic movie, that when the death angel was coming to free Israel from Egyptian slavery, that the angel passed over the Israelites who had sacrificed a lamb and were inside actually eating that lamb meal. And there's a lot of things to go into this. I think the Jews now call this the Seder meal. But this is why they call it the Passover. The death angel passed over Israel as they were imprisoned as slaves in Egypt. In the Christian calendar, that Passover was converted, so to speak, into the Last Supper, and you and I participate in communion when we celebrate this Last Supper, remembering what Jesus said, "As oft as you do it, you do this in remembrance of me," the broken bread representing his body, and the shed blood is represented in the grape juice or the wine. I would invite you all, if possible, to pause this if it's evening and see if you could not find some bread and some grape juice and have communion with your family tonight. We can't have it together, and God bless all of you who are hanging in there while we try to survive the virus's spread. But today, for our thoughts, I want to turn to a very famous pastor who was a wonderful storyteller in his sermons, Peter Marshall. And I'd like to read from his sermon on the first Easter and share with you his thoughts. They abide by the Scripture, yet there are no references to the exact passage that this is referencing. So, if you don't mind, allow me to read. It was night. Outside in the streets of Jerusalem, shadows fled before a full moon rising over the pinnacles of the temple. Time was ebbing towards its close and its beginning. The cleft that would, for the rest of recorded history, mark it before Christ and after Christ. A sinister silence beat in upon the heavy hearts of a group of 12 men gathered in an upper room. They knew that something dreadful was about to happen, and they were apprehensive. This was the last night of Jesus' life on earth. He had looked forward to this occasion, having his own apostles, his chosen friends, his intimate companions, for 3 years grouped around him in the fellowship of the Last Supper. He had himself made the arrangements for the supper, Look for a man carrying a pitcher of water, he had told his disciples. That in itself would be an unusual thing, for it was the women who usually carried the water. The man would lead them to this upper room, perhaps in the home of John Mark's father, a guest room built on the flat roof of the house. Pillars supported a roof closed in with curtains, and the curtains billowed and swung in a cool evening breeze. A lamp hanging from the ceiling cast flickering light. The men were reclined on couches around a low U-shaped table. At the master's left was Simon Peter, at his right, John. A quiet voice spoke. "With desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." Bronzed hands took a loaf of bread, gave thanks for it, broke it. "This is my body, which is given for you. This do in remembrance of me." The Last Supper was to institute a memorial, the loving desire to be remembered. Christ relied upon homely symbols, a piece of bread, a cup of juice of the lowly grape, to recall him to future generations. He knew that he would be in constant danger of forgetting him. He knew that we would be in constant danger of forgetting him. Therefore, he enlisted sense on the side of faith and trusted to these simple everyday memorials for the recalling to our treacherous memories of his undying love. This is the blood of the New Testament, a new agreement which is shed for many for the remission of sins. Drink you all of it. But I say unto you, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. Strange words with which to institute a sacrament. What did he mean? The words that fell from his lips that night are standing evidence of Christ's own estimate as to where the center of his work lies. We are to remember his death. Never did he ask that we should commemorate his birth. Not once did he request that any of the wonderful deeds he performed should be immortalized. Only this, his last and greatest work, the work of redemption. This was to be his memorial, a cross to remind us that God's love for us is a love that hate cannot nullify and death cannot destroy. Already, days before, he had told his apostles, "Behold, we go to Jerusalem. The Son of Man shall be mocked and spitefully entreated, and they shall scourge him and put him to death. The third day he shall rise again." Outside, the night was silent, as if all Jerusalem held its breath, feeling the approach of the storm. Like sequins, the lights of the city appeared twinkling one by one, and an indigo sky grew darker and darker. One by one, the city's noises were silenced, but in the room itself there was a noise, for the disciples were quarreling. Their argument had started earlier in the day as they had walked to the supper. Then they had divided into smaller groups so as not to attract too much attention as they gathered for the evening meal. Because there were no servants to bathe their feet, and because they had been arguing about who was to be chief among them, nobody had made any gesture of ceremonial washing. They had walked past the earthenware pitcher of water at the door and had taken their places around the table, angry, argumentative, sulking, cross, tired. We can imagine them stretching out their robes so as to cover their feet, trying to pretend there was nothing wrong when everything was wrong. They had looked like sulky schoolboys who wanted to stoop to a slave's work. Now during the supper, Jesus rose and took off his outer garment. Then he took a towel, girded himself, poured water into the basin, and began to do the menial thing that no one of them would do. He began to wash the disciples' feet. And he did it because he was the Son of God. That lowly, loving deed expressed in all its loneliness the glory and humility of his own heart. Did the Apostle John tell us of this incident so that we might understand that those who shared the Last Supper with Jesus of Nazareth were no plaster saints? These were ordinary men, quite like you and me, subject to nerves and temper, to pettiness and self-centeredness. John makes a very significant statement in telling of this incident. He says, "And Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he was come from God and went to God, he rose from supper and began." To reveal his death by signs and miracles? No. To show his authority by displays of superhuman power? No. To act like an all-powerful dictator? No. Christ, knowing who he was, having come forth from God, knowing that he was going to God, began to wash the disciples' feet. The glory of Christ's life on earth was not the ethereal glory of the supernatural, no, but rather the simple fact that he loved us, that he loved unlovely men and women with a love that goes on loving and goes on loving and goes on loving so that nothing can ever defeat it. Nothing can ever break it down. Having loved his own which were in the world, adds John, he loved them unto the end. Then Christ again took his place at the table, and all eyes were upon him, and a look like shadows blotting out the sun crossed the Master's face. Verily I say unto you, that one of you shall betray me. The apostles were shocked. Peter blurted out, "Lord, surely it isn't I." And one by one they all asked, "Lord, is it I?" He it is to whom I shall give a sop when I have dipped it. That would be a morsel of bread into a broth. Judas was sitting second from the Master on the right, with John between them. Jesus had known all along that Judas had been plotting. He knew that Judas had gone to the chief priests some days before and had offered to help them arrest Jesus. For Caiaphas, the high priest, had long since decided that this Jesus of Nazareth must be gotten out of the way. So Christ took a piece of bread and, dipping it into a bowl of broth, handed it to Judas. So Christ took a piece of bread and, dipping it into a bowl of broth, handed it to Judas. And slowly Judas rose to his feet. He strode towards the stairway, then pausing, with one hand on the heavy curtains, he turned and faced Christ. An awful look passed between them, sorrow on the face of the Master, determination, strain, evil on the swarthy face of Judas. Then he turned and was gone. The curtains swung behind him. There was silence. And John adds this comment, "And it was night." I'm so happy to have brought you that bit of a reading and a story, the account of Jesus in that last night. Tomorrow, I hope to be able to read to you about his arrest in the garden. Tomorrow is Good Friday. So again, tonight, if you possibly can, maybe as a family, that you could take bread and juice and break it and share the cup and enjoy communion. the Last Supper.